Welcome to this video. In this video, we will be discussing the pre-lab, the setup for our first virtual lab, which is the scientific method using Alka-Seltzer lab. So in this video, we will go through some of the material that you'll want to know before you get to lab, as well as go through the materials list for things that you need to pick up, things that you need to have ready on the day of the lab so that you can do the lab successfully. So let's get into it. Starting with the lab itself. Now, this lab is a lab that we have adapted from a Carolina distance learning lab. The original PDF for this is available on their website. But if you follow through, really what this lab is going after is the scientific method. And the scientific method, remember, is the approach that scientists take to answer questions. And it's a rather elaborate process where there are lots of different twists and turns in the road where we can make decisions on things, devise experiments, answer questions, use observations, and other things to drive analysis and make decisions. So just a little bit of background here. This is stuff that we saw in some of our previous videos, what we talked about in lecture. Science is that discipline that helps us to build a better understanding of the world around us. The scientific method is a means by which we do that. A hypothesis is a testable explanation for what something is. Or a better way of saying that is a testable explanation for some sort of thing that we can observe. And any knowledge that we acquire through the scientific method can help us to test this hypothesis that we are building. So let's talk a little bit about the scientific method in general. And so in the information on Blackboard, in that procedure and handout that I gave you in Blackboard, we have here a rough sketch of one way to look at the scientific method. And the scientific method, if you think about it as this kind of streamlined process going from beginning to end, we start with observations. We see things occurring around us, and those observations naturally lead to our inquisitive nature to ask, well, why is this the case? So we make observations about the world around us. That turns into us asking questions about what we're seeing. And that eventually leads to an explanation. That is what we call a hypothesis, an explanation that explains what is being asked through those observations. And once we have a hypothesis, then we can go about testing that hypothesis. So we go and ask the question, we make an observation. Our observation is a person can run faster with running shoes versus other shoes. Okay, observation. That leads us to the question, why do running shoes help us run faster? We can develop a hypothesis. Running shoes are lighter, so it is easier to run in them. And then we could design an experiment around this hypothesis. Maybe we set up a experiment where run for a distance in several different types of shoes that are weighed before. So we get a bunch of different types of shoes. We design an experiment that allows the person to run in these different types of shoes, and we weigh the shoes before the experiment to determine if the person with the lightest shoes, or rather, person wearing those lightest shoes go faster than the one wearing the heaviest shoes. And so we run an experiment. We collect data. We then analyze that data and determine if the hypothesis is correct or incorrect. And from there, this is where things can get a little bit more cyclical. Right now, everything seems to be in a very flat line. We do this, and then 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 we do this. If the hypothesis is supported, then chances are we go and we repeat the experiment, and we continue to gather data to support this hypothesis. But if the hypothesis is not supported, then we go back to the hypothesis stage. Okay, what was wrong with our hypothesis? What assumptions did we make that were incorrect? We fix those mistakes, and then we go through the process of designing an experiment, collecting data, analyzing data again, and determining if our adjustments to the hypothesis are now validated or correct. And the process continues and continues and continues. So there are some turnbacks on this overall progression of the scientific method. There are places where we can go and turn around and re-examine things. So for example, I do this experiment and I realize, boy, this experiment's terrible. It's not actually giving us the data that we want. It's not giving us the data that we need. Well, that doesn't mean that we necessarily completely abandon the hypothesis. We just recognize that the experiment's bad and we go back and we devise a better one. So there are some places where we can pick things up and move on and kind of address things along the way. So that's the general idea of the scientific method. And you're going to investigate this through the use of an experiment regarding Alka-Seltzer. Now, when it comes to devising experiments, there are a couple of things that we need to know. First of all, we want to make sure that we are devising a good experiment. The way that we can devise a good experiment is we have to take into consideration what are our variables. What are the things that are possible to change that would make a significant impact on our ability to measure the data properly and investigate the question properly as well. Now, there are 3 types of variables that we are going to take some time in looking at. There is the independent variable. This independent variable is the factor that's hypothesized to produce an effect. And so going back to our example of shoes and running, we would be talking about the mass of the shoes as our independent variable in this case, because what our ultimate hypothesis was that the lighter the shoes were, the better that people were going to run, the faster that they were going to run. The dependent variable is a variable that also is measurable. So we can measure the mass of the shoes by putting them on a balance, but the value of the dependent variable depends upon the independent variable. That is, the independent variable influences the measurement of the dependent variable. So the dependent variable in our example would be how long did it take the person to run the course or run the distance that we prescribe in the experiment itself. So we compare the mass of the shoes versus the time it takes for the person to run the distance on the track. So a good way of kind of thinking about this relationship between independent and dependent variables is kind of thinking about like it's an if-then statement. If I do this, then what will happen to this? If I change the mass of someone's shoes, then the time it takes them to run the course is going to change as well. If and then. The other kind of variable that we would want to look at here is something called a control variable. The controlled variables would be all of the other kinds of variables that we would encounter in the course of the experiment. And these would be ones that would be unchanged for the experiment itself. So what would be some examples of controlled variables? Person running. I wouldn't give running shoes to one person and cowboy boots to another person and compare their results against each other to determine the effect of the weight of the shoes. That wouldn't make much sense. What if the person that is wearing the running shoes runs way faster than the person that wears the cowboy boots, just on their own, barefoot? So the person running would have to run the course every single time in all the different types of shoes. Other factors, things like environment. If I was trying to control for those factors, because anyone who goes running can tell you wind can be a really big impact on how fast or slow you run a course. If it's raining or snowing, those can impact as well. So we probably do this inside on maybe like an indoor track or something like that, where environmental factors are going to be considerably less predominant. We look at other factors like time of day, temperature of the environment. All of those things would be controlled variables, things that we would want to look at from day to day to day to day and keep them as consistent as possible. So those are the three types of variables. Again, when we think about our hypotheses, the word that needs to come to mind with a hypothesis is testability. This needs to be something that you can actually measure and test. So when you're creating your own experiments here in this particular example, you're going to want to make sure that you keep that at the forefront of your mind. Now, in terms of what materials you need, this is the only lab in our list where you're going to have to go out and acquire materials. Most of the materials that you need are things that you can probably find at home. The only thing that you may not be able to acquire at home, depends on what you have at home, are Alka-Seltzer tablets. For this experiment, you will need 10 tablets in total. That's 5 2-packs. If you do not have Alka-Seltzer at your house or in your room, You can very easily acquire it. I know Dollar General has Alka-Seltzer tabs. I think you'll have to spend about $2 to $3 to get them. I know Walmart sells packs of 24, I believe, for about $4. Um, so you're going to have to go out and get those materials. Should be relatively easy to do though. You're going to need a scissors, a set of scissors or knife. Really, all you're doing is you're going to score the tablets so that you can break them in half. That's what the scissors or the knife is for. So you don't need anything too terribly sharp. You're really just kind of cutting a ridge in the middle of it so that you can easily break the tablet in half. You're going to need tap water that has been left out at room temperature for at least 20 minutes. Hot tap water. This can be just turn your faucet on to hot, let it get as hot as it can, and go that way. You're going to need ice to make an ice water bath. The directions for that are in the procedure. You're going to need a measuring cup. How big the measuring cup really doesn't matter. You want to be consistent. That's the real key. To make sure that you have enough space, we are recommending a 1-cup measuring cup. But again, if you don't have that, if you have something that you can just kind of measure consistently, something like a coffee cup, or some other kind of beverage holder, the important thing is that you're getting the same amount of water each time. Something to mark with so that you can label your hot water and your cold water and your room temperature water as being separate and different from each other. You need some kind of a plastic cup or bowl that's capable of holding about a cup of water, a larger bowl to make the ice bath, and some kind of timing device. Your cell phone is certainly okay for this. If you have a stopwatch feature on your watch, or a timer feature on your phone, all of these would work fine. So that's this lab in particular. It's relatively straightforward. When you come to lab on Tuesday, we will go through the procedure and how you kind of have to go through this stuff already. I would recommend that you read through the procedure and that you come with questions. But until we get to that point, that's all I have for you here. Have a good afternoon, a good day, and I will see you on Tuesday afternoon for this particular lab.